Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to an FS Club webinar. Today, we have as our guest Gary Hunting, and Gary is here to talk to us today about risk in the boardroom. Are you making the right calls? Now, those of you out there probably know me. I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm the executive chairman of CN, and it really is my delight and privilege to be able to be one of the chairmen of these various webinars. And we can only do this really thanks to the generosity of our sponsors. We have a wide range of sponsors that you can see here. We're delighted to welcome some new ones, Ceridian and the Technium Global. So some stuff moving out there and having a lot of fun. But what's great about our sponsors, they let us range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And one of the areas where technology, economics, and finance meet is risk. Now, Gary asked me today to make a specific point. I said that with our audience, we wouldn't need to over-egg this, but he is going to be talking about risk in the boardroom. So this is much more a qualitative approach to risk than a quantitative one. Gary's not afraid of taking questions about quantitative risk or anything like that, but we will be focusing on what it's like in the boardroom, and that's not normally the place where people are poring over spreadsheets or value-adjusted risk analyses. So with that caveat, the rest about Gary and his distinguished career was on the emails that were sent to you and also on the website if you'd like to refresh yourself. The slides are contained in the chat room area and also posted on the website. And very finally, as you know, we try and reserve about 20 minutes for Q&A, questions and answers, and please use the GoToWebinar questioning facility to send your questions to me, and I will try and field them to Gary in a conversation in the latter half of this webinar. Please do use the GoToWebinar facility, sending me an email. I'm here with you, so I'll get the email afterwards. That won't be much use. If we don't get to answer all questions, so do get them in early, I will be fielding all questions to Gary so that he can get back to you individually. So with that, I think it's no more ado. And Gary, it's really over to you, I think, to sort of just set the scene here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for tuning in. What you're going to hear now is a short talk for no more than 20 minutes. Falls into 4 sections. You've got 2 polls in here, so some questions for you to get your teeth into. The risk in the boardroom, I really want to talk about philosophy to start with. First thing I'm going to talk about, cast your mind back 50 years. Milton Friedman's quote in the New York Times, the link's there for those who want to look at it later. The social responsibility of a business is to increase its profits. Friedman wrote that at the time because he felt that social responsibility was just socialism by another name. Now, if you think back, the next slide, please. If you think back to 1970, what do you think of? Future Shock just came out then, Alvin Toffler's book. The Beatles, most people were shocked that the Beatles had broken up, but there are a lot of other things if you remember 1970. But come up to date now, 50 years on, and look at what Larry Fink has said this year, BlackRock. The one thing that's very clear in this COVID world is that stakeholder capitalism is going to become more important. And he's talking about clients, employees, society. This is the antithesis of what Friedman said. So my question to you guys out there, and the first poll is, here we are. Is Friedman basically right? A board should answer only to its shareholders. Or is Fink right? A board can serve other audiences, such as society and environment, as well as shareholders. So you're going to have a vote now. Could you please click, or whatever it is you have to do, on the right answer? And we'll take a poll.
That's great, Gary, and we're already up to over half of people have voted already, so fingers were very clearly on the buzzards there. I'm just going to give a split second to let a few people finish. Great. Yeah, almost the entire audience has voted, so I'm going to close the poll now and share the results.
Wow, that is a very woke audience. That is very 2020. Interesting. Right, we'll see where we go. Good job I'm talking a bit about ESG then. Okay, on to the next section.
Okay.
Thank you very much. The next slide. Okay, What I do here is just talk through how I put it into 3 silos. Financial return, ROI, and dividend. This is a commercial reason people would invest. It's been going for 2,000 odd years. That's understandable. The second model there, the value-based, is where people invest without any financial incentive, but they have some reason, principle, reason to change. This is a moral decision, and these have been around for 200 odd years. Think back to the Quakers, Methodists, and what have you. These people aren't looking for money. They're looking to make change, principle. The third box, the hybrid, I call it political. Some people wouldn't, but I call it political. Seen for the last 20 years. I put ESG and impact investing in the same box here for a reason. We'll come on to that in the next one, but those are the 3 pieces. So if I go to the next slide, please, Mike. This is rather a wordy slide, and I don't expect anyone to get into big detail. I've got another one with less words on in a moment, but it shows that the SRI element, which is the value-based, is the piece on the left-hand side, which is where there is no financial return expected. We look at the other 2. I'm assuming most of this audience already understand the difference in ESG and impact. Can we go to the next slide, Michael, because there's slightly less copy on that. This is the same division of the 3, picked up on a website called PitchBook. If I just take the ESG one, it's saying that metrics, non-financial risk, of course, ESG is looking at non-financials. Impact, of course, is trying to complete the circle and saying, actually, we can get some returns. It's just a matter of how you define them. If you define them in terms of the SDGs from the United Nations or whatever, we can get some return. So really what I want to try and do here is show that, what are we talking about sustainability? So could I have skip the next one and go to the next one? Sorry, Mike. We'll leave that one. That's another much more detailed definition showing these. Now stop here a second. Something that's happened earlier this month. Assets under management in funds that abide by ESG have surpassed $1 trillion for the first time on record. And below it is an advert I happened to pick up in February from UBS. This whole question of sustainability. The word sustainability means so many different things to different people. Some people think it's actually been over-egged. Now, if we look at the next slide, please. Slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. This is a piece from the FT only a week ago, digging in on what people mean by sustainability and sustainable. The concept of FANG stocks, that actually a lot of sustainable funds have actually got businesses in them that some people would say are not actually sustainable. So I'm not going to try and get into the definition of sustainability here, but I just wanted to flag up the fact that the word sustainable is open to a lot of definitions. We move on to the next slide, please. Here, MSCI, a ratings agency quite well known to most of you, have put together a lovely color box system, not dissimilar to the United Nations SDGs, showing how you might look at sustainable impact solutions. This is just one approach, and of course there are others. We move on to the next slide, please. The last slide I want to show here is the ESG disclosures on the non-financial reporting directive from the EU. This is shows 25 different metrics. So how we define sustainability is not something I'm going to try and define today, but I want to move on to a section I call trends to watch, which I think is where this audience might get some interest and where we can actually have another poll in a minute. Right, firstly here, one trend that I think is noticeable is the impact investing. There have been a lot of people writing about it in the last few months saying, this is where ESG is going. It's giving ESG some teeth. It's showing where you can actually have a return. But this chap, a Deloitte partner, writing in Responsible Investor, says it's actually showing the characteristics of a bandwagon. And people don't always know what it means. They can make overclaims on it, and it's just getting to be a buzzword. So I'd like you to plant that thought for a moment and just have a look at the second trend I've seen here. Next slide, please. Thank you. The other trend, of course, is the fact that ESG doesn't have a full panoply of support. The fossil fuel lobby in the States and the Department of Labor in the States are beginning to say, hang on a minute, let's get back to Friedman economics and talk about financial considerations and numbers. Forget all this fluffy stuff about social and environmental things. Let's look at the numbers. And of course, we're still waiting for the SEC to come out on one side or the other, and they're pretty ambivalent at the moment. So there's an issue there about will there be a strong enough lobby in the US to halt the ESG drive at the moment? And the third point is another one which comes back to lawyers and accountants. Disclosure liability. For those of you who know what IAS 37 is, I'm afraid I don't know, but it's quite important to accountants. Here you have something that talks about contingent liabilities, and of course, the liabilities from climate risk and some of the fossil fuels investments and this kind of thing. One industry person has said, we see climate risk like the tobacco industry, and that at some point, class action suits, lawsuits, punitive damage will become probable. And we only have to read about what Storeboard did this week and disinvesting. So I think there's quite an important issue there on is disinvesting going to be more of a trend? So let's have a poll. Now let's go to the next poll. Michael?
Good. Do you want to just read the questions out quickly?
Yeah. So the first thing is, do you think in the immediate future are we going to have credible impact investing products, or do you think this is just a lot of smoke and mirrors? Or is the lobby pressure going to kick back and ESG is going to come against the buffers because of people saying you've got to hit the numbers? Or is the legal pragmatism going to be an issue? In other words, are people going to start saying, avoid the toxic sectors, bail out of them now? So voting, please.
Great. So folks, impact investing, creating credible non-financial value equivalents, lobby pressure to rubbish ESG and defensive freedmen economics, or legal pragmatism, risk aversion for future potential toxic sectors. And again, I cannot believe how fast people are on their buzzers. Very impressive, folks. The audience objected, I might point out. A couple of people have sent me messages saying, please don't call me woke, but they are very woke, at least when it comes to polls. So I'll now show everybody the results of the poll. If you just give me a moment, poll is closing, and I'll now share the results. And over to you then, Gary.
Thank you very much. Well, that's interesting. That's kind of what I expected. The impact investing and the legal pragmatism. Well, certainly the legal pragmatism is a very important one. Over half of you think that the liability possibility is something to steer clear of, and that's quite interesting. I don't know how the fossil fuels are going to solve that one. It's one of the problems that you are what you are. I remember having a client who didn't like their rating on FTSE for good, and we just said, well, that's what you are. Sorry. So the lobby pressure one has gone away. Not so big. Interesting. I don't know how much of the audience is US and UK, but that does indicate that I think that's not going to come off. Anyway, thank you very much for that. We can return to some of those issues in the questions. Final section before I shut up and over to you, the audience. I've put a couple of, I call them case studies. That's a bit simplistic. Just going to talk about a couple of things. The reason I'm doing these is to show you, as much as anything, back to my favorite topic of interpreting and understanding risk, is that it means different things to different people. So let's just have a look at the BlackRock example here, please. Michael, first slide. Thank you. Forgive me for the wordiness of this. All these next few slides come from an article written in the New Republic in the States in February by a chap called John Leary, and I thought it was quite good, and I've taken chunks of it here, so it's not my writing. Point being that back in January, Larry Fink's annual letter to shareholders, to investors, talks about getting on the sustainability, I won't say bandwagon, but actually it being something that they can't ignore any longer. And people have then mentioned, well, hang on a minute, how can you take a position on that when you're the largest investor in fossil fuels? So there's a potential conflict of interest there. So two issues we looked at here. Second, next slide, please. Michael, thank you. The the fact that from an investment point of view, I mean, obviously the first paragraph is about what people think risk is normally. In other words, something to avoid. That I deal with a lot, and you all know that most risk departments are looking at avoiding damage and danger and business continuity issues. But of course, from an investment point of view, it is, as the headline here says, for financiers, risk is not something to be avoided, but something to be managed. You want to measure and assess it, not eliminate it. So first thing there is, there's no inconsistency. And the next point, if I could move to the next slide, please, Michael, is the concept of sustainability. Now, of course, the first paragraph here talks about it being very much a laudable goal, worthy, but nothing to get your teeth into. Of course, the second one then points out that actually does not mean that you're fighting climate change. You're actually profiting from where it's going. So from an investment point of view, it's saying there's no contradiction to investing from coal mines while investing in coal-fired power plants. So I think the point of this, if I can move to the final slide on this section, forgive me for all the wordiness of those. Risk means what the speaker wants it to mean. Don't assume it's what you think it is. Same with sustainability. Ambiguity, obfuscation can come back to haunt you. Questions I always say, and people, risk of what and risk to whom are always good questions to ask. Clarify what the damage the risk might cause and who might suffer from it. So I think this article I've talked about there was picking apart the supposed inconsistencies in BlackRock getting involved with sustainability. So that's just one case study of how you see risk. Second one, I'm going to look at RTZ. Some of you will know in the UK press, this is from the Times in August, got a lot of bad press because they actually, in Pilbara in the Western Australia, destroyed some Aboriginal caves, which were of primary architectural value to the Aborigines. In fact, if we look at the next slide, which is less words and much more exciting, was written by an Australian cartoonist in June, which really shows the cynicism they saw of a huge player in their economy having total disregard for the economy and for the heritage, the Aboriginal heritage. Actually, what we have found here, and the next slide looks at the timeline, and I don't intend to go into too much detail, is that a report was commissioned 2 years ago, but nobody on the board read it. And these valuable archaeological sites were destroyed, despite the fact they had initially tried to understand them. And the value gain in terms of tons of iron ore, I think it is, was negligible, given the PR damage. And I think those of you who've seen the press this week that 3 senior board members have had to forego their bonuses, which are quite substantial in RTZ. For those who want to know more about this subject, there's a huge piece in today's Guardian on it, but I'm not sure how many of you in the audience are Guardian readers. But anyway, there's a huge piece today on this very subject. The lessons about it: make sure all board members know what's going on. If you commission a report, make sure everyone reads it and understands the findings. If you ignore the findings, be prepared to live with the consequences. This helps define acceptable risk for collective responsibility. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the conclusion of my piece, and it's over to you. Thank you. Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Kerry. That was brief, sharp, and punctual, all absolutely excellent qualities, and therefore a riskless presentation from our point of view. Folks, I'd again encourage you to get your questions in quickly because we already have quite a few comments. But fortunately, Gary's given us a very much adequate time to chat about it. As I mentioned, Gary, a number of people objected to woke, and if you want to,
sorry, yeah, it's not the word everyone likes. I agree.
If you want to expand on woke, please go ahead and do so. We also had an interesting comment from Mike Clark when you were talking about Larry Fink and the situation at BlackRock. He said the Dannon CEO said a while ago, Larry keeps writing to me, but his portfolio managers don't seem to read them. That I think Mike Clark's made a very good point there about the potential hypocrisy in this system. And Rhonda Ocha's got a couple of comments, but I just wanted to share quickly this one, where she points out the risk, the risk of losing your investment. And I must say, I have a lot of sympathy with that, Rhonda, that, you know, people are here busy telling me about my risk, but my risk was one about investing. And that might be primary. So perhaps some of those US moves are not so inane. Anyway, let's get into a couple of questions here. Well, let's pick up really Shan Turnbull. Shan says here, how might non-executive directors, NEDs, protect themselves from the risks of auditors being allowed to describe themselves as independent, but being captured by management to allow creative accounting to put NEDs' reputations at risk?
So he's worried about, he's worried that the NEDs are at the mercy of auditors. Is that the issue?
It would appear so.
I think basically the story for NEDs is be aware of what you get into. I think if you're spreading yourself too thinly, I mean, the job of a NED is to understand the issues and not just float in and float out. It's very difficult, especially if you don't have enough time. The job of a NED is are you baubles on a Christmas tree? No, you're there to be the conscience of the board and to remind them of what the purpose is. You have a very important role. You do share in the collective responsibility. So I think the important thing is to do your due diligence. It's very nice to take the money, but what comes with it is responsibility. I don't quite see the problem there. I mean, you know, you are a non-executive director, which means you have to provide an oversight role to the rest of the executive, I think.
Yeah, but I think Shan's got an interesting point here. I might turn not just from accounting, but there were proposals around 8 to 10 years ago that there ought to be an independent NED in financial firms who was responsible for risk. And the idea that this person would be the one you took out back and shot in the head if the firm hit some risk factors. But as I pointed out at the time, this implies that somebody who is doing what is meant to be a part-time governance role is not only supposed to encompass the bank, let's call it a bank or insurer, because that's what the proposal was about, encompass their entire risk function, but also to run the scenarios that they haven't run. So suddenly it becomes much more than a full-time job. It's a full-time job to see what the current bank or insurance risk management function is doing, and then to portray all of the others. I mean, just in computational purchases alone, you'd have to run a very, very large unit. So how do you keep this into account? And so I think Sean's got a good point here about the independence of independent advisors in general.
I think you're right. I certainly wouldn't want to see an NED specifically with the handcuffs of being the risk man or the risk woman. I think that's wrong. I have views on risk and how risk is seen as a area of expertise on some boards, and I have to be careful how I tread here, because part of my executive training arm is saying, look, any director can spot a risk. You don't have to. When I was a brand manager and I went to the advertising agency, I was told to shut up because only the creative director could have a creative thought, and that's not true. Anyone can have a creative thought. Similarly here, anyone around the board table can spot a risk. You don't have to have a particular qualification. Yes, if you are a forensic accountant and you're an internal auditor and you go looking for trouble, you have a certain ferretability. But I think here, I don't really understand the problem. I think to be an NED, your job is to spot things that the board wouldn't spot. So you will spot risks they haven't seen. It isn't to talk about the quality of the risks they've seen, but it's to give a perspective that you've got from the outside. So that's the important thing, is you've got eyes from standing in a different viewpoint.
Okay, well, Rhonda Ochik has a question that I think flows from that. What do you think about the fear factor for boards who are called out by investors who see reputational risks for companies that are not sustainable or ESG woke?
The fear factor is it's about fashion, isn't it? I mean, I go back a long way, back into CSR and sustainability back in the 90s and noughties and what have you, and I see this as something that is currently for most boards, not non-investment areas, but in most corporate boards, there is a fear that we ought to be doing something about ESG. What should we do? What should we do? We've got a sustainability report. Should we have an ESG report? I think the danger is there's an element of smoke and mirrors. I think if you genuinely want to do something that does good beyond just making money, then you want to be very clear why you're doing it. Yes, there's a fear of doing nothing, but there's also the fear of doing the wrong thing. I see people coming and saying, look, we must do this, and I say, well, hang on a minute, what do your shareholders really want to do? What are their sensitivities? You know, if they're all about environment stuff and you're doing social stuff, then you're missing the point. You've got to join up the dots. I think you've got to be aware of where your shareholders' interest is and what their main focus is. Depends on the nature of the business and the sector. Sorry, I don't know.
Yeah, that's good. I've got a couple of questions here from Matthew Leach. One sort of about scope creep. When and how did sustainability get hijacked and lumped with things that are not much to do with resource constraints and pollution? You know, I've got a lot of sympathy here. You know, Grundtland, you know, the commission, the original UN sustainability report in the 70s, was you know, very focused on effectively what now is called the cyclical or circle economy. Yeah. Which is fine. You use the least, waste least, make the least impact. But now we seem to use sustainability as a kind of a very bad adjective for good that I would like. So do you want to address Matthew's point there?
I think it's a word that's open to, I mean, I used to work in an outfit called the Centre for Sustainability at a UK university. And I would talk about business sustainability. And then I'm going to talk to the architects and planning department about builder sustainability, and completely different things. You know, sustainable construction is very different to a business that is sustainable or not sustainable. So you have to know your audience. I do think, yes, it's a word that needs bolting down. And I do think there is a lot of creep around the word sustainability. From what I see, looking for ESG reports, a lot of them are remassaged sustainability reports. And I think you have to be very careful about how far you go with sustainability and what you mean by it. I think you have to draw boundaries. One of the first things I do on a course talking about ESG is boundaries. You know, what do we hear? Where do we overlap with sustainability and responsibility and all the other things? Because it is a creepy. You're right, Matthew. There is creep. I don't think you can ring fence sustainability. I think it depends on the sector and the business, what they define as sustainable. I think it's tricky if you're in mining or extracting or primary industries, where you're using a resource that comes out of the ground and isn't easy to replace. I don't actually know, and haven't got an easy answer on that. I know that certain retailers, it's about packaging. And as you rightly say, cyclical, you know, how can we make sure we don't have plastic waste and blah, blah, blah. Every day there seems to be some new twist on this. You're right, it's got out of hand. And I always try and find out what the language of the client is and work with that.
Well, I might pick up on this in a way, Gary, that you know, by trying to achieve so much, we achieve nothing. The traditional mantra is, you know, that business gets things done. It's one of the things that governments frequently do when they bring people in the business community into government departmental roles, is this perhaps unproven idea that business people do things and sometimes government doesn't. So that all sounds fine, but if I have to do everything, I can't. And these days, the numbers of initiatives, the plethora is just overwhelming. I've got dolphin-friendly tuna, I've got canopy-grown coffee beans, I've got child labor, I've got minimum wage, I've got waste, I've got microplastics, you know, I've got fair trade, and I've actually also got a business to run. So would it be, and many of these things actually ought to be market forces. I ought to be saving on waste and going cyclical simply because wastage would cost me so much. So market forces are meant to work in this way. These seem in many ways like shortcuts that both undercut market forces and also render managers powerless and frankly at prey to any passing fad that can get enough media attention. So
I agree.
would companies be better perhaps to say, look, I know, let's say I'm in packaging and I'm doing fish. So I know dolphin friendly tuna, I know the Marine Stewardship Council, I know about the packaging for that. I'm very good at that. That's what I know about. I don't know a lot about canopy grown coffee beans and what they're doing in my canteen or other retailers who serve it with me. So this is what I will do, and this is what I won't do.
Exactly. I think that's exactly the case. I mean, I trying to put together a timeline. You can go back to Rio 92. In fact, yeah. 92 is when we had the first corporate code. So you could say the G element started in 92, if you like.
Did you pick Rio? Did you pick Rio deliberately? Given Rio Tinto zinc.
No. It's just happened to be the timeline. And then you see, this is why I from an outsider's point of view, I use the word political carefully. But when you look at what the UN is doing and what the EU is doing, UN and its 17 SDGs and the EU with the NFRD, these are political pressures. And in a sense, although Friedman would label them socialist, they are social pressures that it is questionable whether a business should be engaged in. Morally, yes. Commercially, that's the big issue. And I think with this whole ESG issue, I think it's fascinating that people are running around trying to justify it financially when in fact there is a large political overlay. And I think there's a lot of I say smoke and mirrors. It's just if you strip it away, a lot of organizations are mindful of the 17 SDGs. Yeah. They seem to be getting into everybody's reporting at the moment. And it's quite fluffy because the timeline is to 2030. You've got 10 years. I mean, I haven't examined a lot of impact investment criteria, but the ones I've seen, they're not short term.
Okay. Well, I mean, SDGs have, I wouldn't say crept, actually. I think there's some intellectual base into a lot of our stuff, but I did smell just a teensy whiff of Milton Friedman out there in your last comment. Now, Matthew Leach goes on, and I do want to turn to some other questions, so keep this quite brief. Your second poll, he points out that vote was more what I would like to happen rather than what I think will happen. What do you think will happen of those three? And remember, it was the legal bit that won.
I do think the impact investing is going to be the next wave because it gives people an opportunity to have their cake and eat it. One of the examples I said to people is, as an investor, you might say you want all the warm and fluffy and the good stuff and the social stuff, but actually you want financial return, and you really do want to have them both. And it reminds me of when I was a buyer in my early career with a retailer, and as a buyer in a negotiation with a supplier, you want the cheapest price, best price, you want the fastest delivery time, and you want the highest quality, and that's your triangle. And you're not going to get all three. Everything's going to be a compromise. And I think in dealing with investor demands, it's a trade-off. To what extent do they really want social returns, and to what extent do they want financial returns? And you end up finding where they are on that spectrum. So for me, it's a bit of a debate as to actually what people saying what they mean. What do you really want? You say you want all this, but you actually really want financial return, don't you? Because that's why you're investing. And if you don't get that, then you're in with the Quakers and the Methodists and the people who just want change. So where are you in this?
Let's turn to Mike Clark's made a number of comments. So one, he'd like to promote the excellent Chapter 0, the NED Network on Climate, which is hosted by the Hughes Hall Center at Cambridge for Climate Change Engagement, as a way that NEDs can engage with that and some of the discussions there. But he makes, I think, 2 points. I'll pick the first one up, which is somewhat related to what we were just discussing. He says, I suggest market forces include consumers and citizens who increasingly link SDG risks through profits to MPT risks, also known as beta, really. So in other words, is it not up to the investor to decide that you're you're facing some ESG risks and not responsibly. And so take off the obligatory reporting and stuff, and let people let those market forces through.
Indeed, indeed. I apologize. That was my stomach. That was thunder, by the way. If anyone heard that. Yes, yes. I mean, it is a tricky one. That I think you've got to, as you rightly say, you've got to let the regulators step back, and there has to be an element of market forces. I think there's a danger, both with the UN and EU and a number of other regulators, trying to step in and tweak the market for benefits beyond the commercial.
Okay. Mike also would like your thoughts, Gary, on, do you believe that governments are poor chief risk officers for their state? And do you think that too many risks get to markets because there are poor regulations in the real economy? And he goes on to suggest, do we need to re-nationize some risk management?
I think you're right. I think I'm not very good beyond the UK myself, but I do think some of the risks the state should have, in public safety and pandemic perhaps, but there are various things they really ought to handle better. But I don't really know how that can be done without becoming a totalitarian state that starts to tell people what they can and can't do. Colleague of mine told me the other day that how on earth do they stop people? They know people are quarantining when they come back. They take a phone number of 1 in 5 coming through the airport. They say, oh, well, in Bulgaria, the police knock on your door every day. It depends. It depends what you have in mind for the state controls. I mean, I think it would be nice to say the state should take some greater role, but then who's going to be in charge of the state?
Well, we it's some interesting points here. Not least, I hasten to add, I'm on quarantine myself, having just gotten back, so I am at home. This is my usual home. I am here. But yeah, we have had a couple of interesting sessions already on government risk. This stuff is on the balance sheet. It's not just pandemic, it's cyber, terrorism, and there have been ways of dealing with it. We're going to have a couple more of these sessions coming up. So we've already had Julian Enowizi, Dennis Mahoney, and Liz running out of the TOTUS Re. We've got a few more coming up. So I think that there are mechanisms there, but they're not simple, and that's always a danger. Now, Hugo Innes, you did say maybe you don't have as much international experience, so if you want to skip it, it's okay, but he was just curious, how big is that gap between the European and US approach to ESG? And do you think US pushback is expected, or is this just a discussion?
Well, this is a very good point. This is where I think there is an element of politics. When you look at the way the UK government at the moment views the EU as a sort of socialist enterprise, and I do think there's an element of political gap. It's very difficult to talk in generalizations, but I do think the way the EU is structured and the way it operates, trying to force through things for the good of society or the good of humanity is not quite the same the other side of the pond. I have no great knowledge of it, but I just get a sense that there is a slightly different political hue, but I have no evidence of that.
Okay. I'd like to take, if we could, we've got time just for 4 very short ones, so do keep brief, although the question about to read is a bit lengthy. It's from Shan Turnbull. Australia's oldest and second biggest bank has admitted to some failures in managing foreign transactions and appointed and paid a highly respected, distinguished panel of 3 experts to advise them on the question, what does good risk governance look like? The panel reported that the bank had adopted mainstream governance, which the panel stated was fit for purpose. But this was not true, and that's why the question was raised. So how would you answer that question raised by the bank?
This is the problem. We've seen it with a few corporate forensic investigations of corporate failures in this country, where people say, we did everything right. We did it by the rules. Everybody reported what they were supposed to report. We don't know how this happened because we did all the right things. I mean, if you don't ask the right questions, you don't get the right answers. It's as simple as that. that's the danger with a rules-based approach as opposed to a principles-based approach. The principle is, if something's clearly wrong, you've got to ask the right questions to find out why. Whereas if you do it by rules-based, you just say, well, we've ticked all the boxes. So I don't know that particular example, but I can only answer it in that general way, which is to say the right questions weren't asked.
Okay, Angel Gaviero wanted to ask you a question directly, Gary. Your question about what do you want on ESG was directed to whom? Is it for the asset manager of BlackRock, the trustee of the pension fund behind it, or the beneficiary of the pension that has been saving all his or her life for it?
That's a very good question. Well, I mean, the way I understood that is that it's the climate risk that Larry Fink was talking about. There was the case that if you don't take it seriously, you're missing out on an opportunity to do what the asset management firm does best, which is to make money from putting money in the right places. I think he was very careful how he addressed it, but I think the whole purpose of that article on BlackRock was to say, be careful what you mean by risk. Climate risk, sustainability risk, investment risk, they're not all synonymous. And you're right, there are at least three different parties there with different views on risk. I think you have to be very careful with any, when you trust your investment to somebody, are their values the same as yours? Are they looking at the same problems as you are? Or have they got a different interest? I mean, it's the same even when dealing with my own IFA or personal portfolio manager. Is he going to recommend something that's best in my interest or gives him the best fee? I don't know.
Okay. I'm going to wrap up with an amalgamated question from several members of the audience and a little bit of interpretation by me. Over the years, I've done a lot of work in CSR and ESG issues as well, and I've tended to focus on the volatility reduction that adhering to ESG gives you. In other words, these are risks that will affect your share price, affect perceptions, and therefore you should be looking at this in financial terms as volatility reduction. But that's because, as I chat to senior members, they have what I would call too many measures, too many currencies. So how well am I doing on employing women? How well am I doing on employing minorities? How well am I doing on child labor? And I've got to translate this into financial terms.
Yes.
And so lovely, excellent, ethical Sally comes to see me and says she's lost a ton of money. As her manager, I berate her, and she says, "But boss, I've met all the targets you set me for inclusion and staff happiness and welfare and lack of bullying and all that." And Hurtful Harry comes in and says, "Hey boss, I made a stonking profit." "Yeah, but you've got like the worst performance in all of this." "Well, do you want the money or not?" Exactly. So we are making those decisions, and yet this whole method of reporting in copious amounts of text is not very precise and not very helpful in making those decisions. What do you think we could change?
I think ESG is about to have something landed on it in terms of metrics and measurability. I don't know whether that's going to come from the SEC, not the UN, obviously. EU may come up with something. Somebody somewhere is going to start saying, we've got all these different ratings agencies, alphabet soup. Everybody's claiming different things. We don't know whether they're really claiming it. There are some verification agencies, but there's nobody really saying what the currency is. I think somewhere along the line, a body, I can't see it coming from the UK, maybe European or American, or maybe even Far Eastern, will say, right, this is what defines good ESG, and this is what defines slightly poor ESG. And it's a basket. It's a basket of measures, good or bad. There will be debate. But I don't think it can go on being quite so qualitative and quite so expansive. I think it will ultimately, I won't say become rules-based, but it will somebody will get. I mean, there is a lot of noise now. If you read all the ESG press, there's a lot of noise. People seem to want some signposting.
Well, Gary, this has been really interesting. This is a topic that is going to run and run. And in fact, if I've taken something away from it myself, it's that maybe Friedman is the theoretical purist, and as Mike Clark has been adding here, politics is risk management writ large. You know your political bit. So maybe it's the political bit that's the realist, and Friedman's the theorist. And risk is, as Mike says, just oozing through the entire savings systems. So interesting stuff. We hope to have you back at some point, maybe to chat about some of these developments. Let's hope that somebody comes up with some magical metric. I personally am skeptical. I think there are too many jobs for the boys and the girls and the big four auditing firms and law firms to help this, because they promote all of these various types of reporting methods. But we'll see. Anyway, we've come to the end of time. I'm getting lots of nice comments about your presentation and your contribution, which is always a sign we've got to go. So if I could, I'd like to make 3 rounds of thanks. My first round of thanks, as ever, to our sponsors for letting us range widely and freely, as you know. My thanks to you for watching. We've got quite a few things coming up. I might point out in particular next Wednesday, Mark Field, former MP for City of Westminster, is actually coming in to talk to us about his new role in the Cayman Islands and international financial centers. That's certainly a very hot topic, and one that divides many of us on what are the good and the bad bits of that, and what should the City of London, what should the City of London's relationship be with them? And we've got quite a few other things coming up, as you'd expect. And then to top it all off, the following week, we will actually be talking to one of those international financial centers, the Turks and Caicos. But my most sincere thanks actually goes to you, Gary Honey. So unfortunately, in these days of COVID and quarantine, I'm unable to bring an audience into my room. But I do have my little Buddhist gong, my karmic clapper, and I will clap for you on behalf of the audience. And
thank you very much.
Thank you most sincerely. Hope to see you back, and hope to see many of you back as well. So thanks all for coming today, and have a very good weekend.
Thank you.
I want it all.